Jackson, Mississippi. Summer of '88. The sun clung to the city like sweat on a collar, thick, unrelenting, and suspiciously quiet. Life in the affluent corners of Jackson moved at the pace of slow molasses, orderly and undisturbed. But then came the kind of silence that didn't just sit, it weighed. The kind that blankets a neighborhood moments before a scream. That morning, in one of Jackson's most aristocratic enclaves, a woman of stature in history, Annie Laurie Herron, vanished without echo. She wasn't just another society name penciled into country club registries. She was the matriarch of a Southern dynasty built on oil, power, and silent influence. Her husband, Robert Herron, a self-made magnate whose handshake could bend stock prices, had left the house as usual, coffee in hand, routine undisturbed. He'd followed the same script for 50 years. By afternoon, Annie had played cards with her friends in the same parlor where her children had once toddled. Nothing seemed out of rhythm. As the last guest left and the housekeeper checked in one final time, Annie gave a soft shake of the head. "No, thank you," she said. "I'm settled for the afternoon." Her tone was final. Peaceful, even. And then, she was gone. When the doorbell rang not long after, Annie assumed someone had returned for a forgotten purse or perhaps a missed word in conversation. She rose from her chair, opened the door, and stepped into a moment that would rip the floor from beneath the Herron legacy. A stranger stood there. Polite. Plain. A courier, maybe. "I've got a message for your husband," he said. "He's not home at the moment," she replied, her voice as southern soft as it was steel-strong. "That's all right," the man said casually. "I can wait." That was the last time anyone laid eyes on Annie Laurie Herron. By the time the grandfather clock rang 4:30, Robert Herron had returned home, expecting the predictable quiet of his evening ritual. But as minutes bled into hours, and Annie's absence stretched longer than habit allowed, a whisper of unease turned into a full-throated alarm. He called neighbors. Relatives. Friends. Each answered with the same chorus, no one had seen Annie. Her car was still nestled in the driveway, untouched. Inside, her shoes waited neatly beside her favorite chair. Her reading glasses sat atop the day's paper. Even her handbag, a constant companion, remained behind, as if its owner had merely stepped into the next room. And then there was the medicine. Annie suffered from a chronic ailment, one that tethered her to a strict regimen of pills and careful timing. She couldn't go long without it, not without consequences. Alarm turned into panic. It was Robert's son-in-law who discovered the envelope. A single sheet of paper, stark against the wooden floor. Addressed to Robert. Its contents, cold, calculated, and bone-chilling. A ransom demand. But this was no ordinary extortion letter. It was a ghost's whisper, cryptic, vague, designed to paralyze. The note made no mention of an amount, no drop-off instructions, no voice promising mercy. Only a list of 12 names and a dire warning: do not contact the authorities. But Robert Herron wasn't the kind of man who bowed to threats. And when the promised phone call never came, he made a decision that would shift the tides of this case forever. He picked up the phone and dialed the Jackson police. They arrived within the hour, cautious, skeptical, unprepared. But it didn't take long for them to realize they were staring down something much larger than a local disappearance. Traces of blood near the doorframe told a silent, sinister story. That night, as the investigation threatened to spiral into uncertainty, one call was made that changed everything. The FBI was brought in. From the moment their boots crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed. Gone were the unsure steps of local law enforcement. In their place, agents in sharp suits, speaking in clipped tones, with minds trained to decode chaos. Special Agent Patrick McLannan, the Bureau's top man in Jackson, took the lead. He didn't bring promises. He brought precision. The FBI wasn't just participating. They were taking control. They turned the Herron residence into a field command. Wiretaps were installed. Incoming calls were monitored. The ransom note was lifted carefully from the desk and ushered into federal custody. Fingerprints, fibers, ink, nothing would be overlooked. The Bureau operated with the patience of surgeons and the intensity of hunters. And what they saw in that note disturbed even them. There was no empathy in the language. No urgency. Just a chilling sentence: pay the damages to 12 men. 12 men who, as Robert would soon reveal, were all linked to a business venture long buried under lawsuits and betrayal, a failed photography enterprise that had cost fortunes and burned bridges. Some of those names belonged to men who had once been allies. Now, perhaps, one or more had become executioners. As the Bureau combed the property for clues, cigarette butts, footprints, scraps of cloth, the evidence grew colder, the trail more elusive. Who had watched this house so closely? Who had waited for the exact moment Annie Laurie would be alone? And what kind of criminal leaves a ransom note without asking for ransom? The morning sun climbed over Jackson like a slow-burning fuse, illuminating more questions than answers. Annie Laurie Herron had been gone for over 36 hours, and the trail was growing colder by the hour. But the FBI was just getting started. Special Agent McLannan wasn't the kind of man to be rattled by silence. He understood its language. Silence meant someone was calculating. Watching. Waiting for the wrong move to make itself known. So he tightened the circle: interviews, canvasses, background checks. Every breath that passed through the neighborhood came under scrutiny. The ransom note, strange in both form and spirit, became the center of the Bureau's attention. No demand for a specific dollar amount. No contact number. No promise of safe return. Just a list. 12 names, each one more than just ink on paper. When McLannan brought the list to Robert Herron, the man's expression changed. Weariness gave way to a deeper, burdened recognition. All 12 had once been involved in a business tied to Herron's wealth, a photography venture turned sour. Former partners, franchisees, plaintiffs, men who had lost money and patience in equal measure. Some had sued the company. Some had gone bankrupt trying to keep it alive. Resentment hung over the names like smoke over a battlefield. The FBI's theory was taking form. This wasn't a random act. It was revenge, cold and calculated. And maybe one of the 12 had finally lost control. The Bureau went to work like clockwork engineers. Field agents from across the country were tapped to begin surveillance. Each man on that list became a ghost worth chasing: their locations, finances, routines. Nothing was dismissed. Meanwhile, McLannan's team turned the Herron house into a forensic labyrinth. They collected every slip of paper, every letter, every typewritten note Annie had ever kept. The ransom note itself, typed on a Royal brand machine, was vintage, dating back to the early 20th century. A rare artifact, but not rare enough to point to a single suspect. There were no fingerprints. No stray hairs. No smudged ink. Whoever wrote it was meticulous or mad. And outside the house? Nothing. Not a single cigarette butt, footprint, or wrapper to hint that anyone had been lurking. Except for one detail. One whisper in the static. A local physician, who lived just down the street, stepped forward. His memory? A white van, parked unusually close to the Herron residence 2 weeks before the abduction. It sat there for hours, unmoving, but with a perfect line of sight to the property. When he approached the driver, a pale, nondescript man, the response was flat, unbothered. The driver asked whether parking was restricted. That was all. Nothing more. The van was gone the next day. Another neighbor, blocks away, had seen it 2 months earlier. But she hadn't just watched. She'd written down the license plate. It led nowhere. The tag had been stolen from the New Orleans airport. A clean van. A false trail. A chess move. As the hours passed, the FBI's behavioral science unit in Quantico joined the hunt. A profiler combed through every thread, from the syntax in the note to the psychological implications of its vagueness. This wasn't a simple grab-and-demand scheme. It was personal. The language didn't seek a transaction. It hinted at something deeper. Damages, the note said. Not ransom. A legal term. Cold. Detached. Civil, as if the writer didn't just want payment, he wanted retribution. The profilers saw the fingerprints of a mind rooted in litigation. Someone who had lost in court and never recovered. The agent's hunch brought one name into the spotlight. Alfred Wynn. A lawyer from St. Petersburg, Florida. Once financially comfortable. Now a man collapsed under the weight of court judgments and tax liens. Wynn had tangled with Robert Harron's old company in court, and he lost hard. 3 bankruptcies, a house on the brink of foreclosure, and everything worth pawning had been stripped from his life. Just 6 weeks before Annie disappeared, Wynn was hit with a final blow, a foreclosure notice nailed to his front door. To the FBI, Wynn wasn't just another name on the list. He was a man cornered, and the profile fit him like a glove. So the Bureau did what it does best. They started to peel him apart. St. Petersburg, Florida. Sunlight bounced off windshields, but the mood inside Alfred Wynn's law office was anything but bright. The man himself, lean, exhausted, and permanently coiled like a spring, was already under the FBI's lens. Every financial move, every whisper of conversation, every quiet visit, all logged, recorded, analyzed. Wynn didn't act like a man who'd committed a crime. But he didn't behave like an innocent one either. He moved with rehearsed confidence, the kind that only comes from years of navigating the courtroom, yet under his skin, something was twitching. His alibi? Thin as gauze. When agents pressed his assistant, a young man with the loyalty of a beaten dog, he claimed Wynn had been at a bar the night of the kidnapping. With a prostitute, no less. But the story was too clean, too ready. And when the FBI pushed harder, the assistant began to sweat. Finally, the scene split. He confessed, Wynn hadn't been at the bar. He had vanished from the office for days. No calls. No trace. Just gone. That was enough for the Bureau to shift gears. Wynn wasn't just a suspect. He was their target. But they still needed proof. Concrete. Physical. Irrefutable. That's when a memory surfaced, one parked at the intersection of coincidence and revelation. A white van. Records showed that Wynn's legal assistant owned such a vehicle. More importantly, it had been borrowed by Wynn repeatedly in the months leading up to the abduction. Enough to drive from Florida to Mississippi and back twice. Now, that wasn't a smoking gun. But it was warm. Still, the FBI had learned not to rush the moment. They needed something that couldn't be explained away. So they circled the van's history. The previous owner was located. A woman, sharp as glass, recalled Wynn buying the van but refusing to sign the buyer's section of the contract. He wanted no paper trail. No documentation. It was a maneuver too paranoid to be casual. Everything pointed to Wynn. But just when the Bureau thought they had a grip, the rug was pulled again. The van? It had been in a repair shop on the day Annie was taken. Another dead end. Weeks passed. Leads dried up like old ink. Annie Laurie Harron had now been missing over a week. Her absence wasn't just painful. It was beginning to feel permanent. Then, out of the blue, a sliver of hope arrived in the mailbox. A letter. Postmarked from Atlanta. When Robert Harron saw the handwriting on the envelope, his knees almost gave out. It was hers. Annie's. The letter was brief, a plea soaked in desperation. She urged Robert to obey the kidnappers, to give them what they wanted. She wrote of being hidden in a basement, sustained only by a few jugs of water. She was terrified. She begged him to act before it was too late. But something in the note rang off-key. Special Agent McLannan read it again, then passed it to Annie's daughter. She didn't hesitate. My mother would never say jugs of water, she said. She'd say bottles. And never basement. She always called it the cellar. It was a subtle thing. But sometimes the truth lives in subtleties. Was the letter dictated under duress? Or forged entirely? No one could say for certain. But McLannan knew one thing: Annie might still be alive. And if there was any chance of saving her, they had to provoke a reaction. So Robert Heron made a choice. He wrote checks to every man on the ransom list, including Alfred Wynne. Each envelope carried not just money, but a personal appeal for Annie's return. It was a high-stakes gamble. And for the FBI, it was bait. Wynne's reaction said it all. He looked at the check, read the letter, and muttered 4 chilling words. "That's not what I wanted." Then, he handed it back to his assistant with a note. "Best wishes for your wife's safe return." It was as close to a confession as Wynne would allow. This wasn't about money. It was revenge, served cold and deliberate. The weeks that followed were slow and cruel. With every day that passed, hope dimmed like a flickering light bulb in a dark hallway. Annie Laurie Heron, socialite, wife, mother, had now been missing for over 3 months. Her absence felt like a wound that refused to close. And despite every trick in the Bureau's playbook, Alfred Wynne remained unshaken. He played the role of the innocent with rehearsed detachment. Polite, elusive, and maddeningly calm. But the FBI wasn't finished. A popular crime television series aired a segment on Annie's disappearance, a carefully constructed piece, subtly crafted. No names were revealed. No accusations made. But the details were accurate enough to stir dormant memories. And it worked. One phone call changed the temperature of the entire investigation. A woman from Florida reached out to the Bureau. Not a relative. Not a bystander. A psychic. Someone who had, in the past, worked with law enforcement, sometimes fruitlessly, sometimes fruitfully. She claimed Wynne had visited her years ago, long before the kidnapping. Back in 1984, he sat across from her in a dimly lit room. Not looking for spiritual comfort. Looking for options. He spoke of legal battles. Financial ruin. A relentless hatred for the people he blamed for his collapse, people like Robert Heron. She remembered what he said as if it had been carved into the air. "I should just take someone. Hold them. Get back what's mine." She told him to let go, to move on. He left, bitter and silent. Now, 4 years later, the prophecy had found flesh. The FBI saw their opportunity. They approached the psychic again, this time with a proposition: stage another meeting. Lure Wynne into conversation. Get him talking. They'd wire her office with cameras, microphones, the whole toolkit. She agreed. Wynne showed up, just like before. The same cool demeanor, the same calculating eyes. She asked casual questions, gently referencing the past, his threats, his anger, his obsession. But Wynne deflected. No admissions. No names. Just shadows. Still, the Bureau knew something now. Wynne trusted her. Enough to show up. Enough to speak. That trust, they could use. And then, another break. The FBI uncovered records showing Wynne owned a remote cabin deep in the Florida wilderness, surrounded by swamp, accessible only by muddy backroads and silence. It was the perfect place to hide something, or someone. Agents descended on the site with quiet urgency. The place was empty. Bone dry. No dishes. No linens. No signs of recent life. But there was no basement, nothing like the sealed room Annie had described in her letter. It was another dead end. Or so it seemed. The investigation began to stall again. That was when Wynne made his first real mistake. He sent a filing cabinet full of legal documents to the IRS, a deliberate act of defiance during an audit. It was his way of overwhelming the system with paper, a flood of misdirection. But buried among the hundreds of pages was something he never intended to reveal. A letter. It outlined a chilling plan, the kidnapping and intended murder of a woman's ex-husband, a conspiracy Wynne had once drawn up with a former girlfriend. It was never carried out, but the letter left no ambiguity. It spoke of using an old typewriter. Of sending cryptic ransom notes. Of hiding the victim in a pre-scouted location. Everything about it echoed Annie's case. The FBI moved quickly. They found the woman now working at a small community college. She didn't hesitate long. Faced with the letter, she broke. She told the agents everything: Wynn's obsession with revenge, his rage at the world, and how he'd asked her to do him a favor in early August 1988, just days after Annie Laurie vanished. They'd met near a hotel. Wynn had handed her an envelope. He refused to speak out loud, paranoid. Instead, he wrote messages on slips of paper. Is your car bugged? Have you been followed? His instructions were precise: travel to Atlanta under a false name. Alter her appearance. Mail the envelope on August 11th. She followed the orders, but couldn't resist glancing at the name on the envelope. It was addressed to Robert Herron. When the FBI showed her the letter Robert had received, the supposed plea from Annie, her reaction was instant. She recognized it. It was the same envelope Wynn had given her. For the FBI, this was the moment everything shifted. They had a living witness, a direct link between Wynn and the letter. The forgery. The manipulation. The timeline. It wasn't enough to close the case. But now, Wynn's fortress was cracking. And the Bureau had just found the first brick to pull. The FBI didn't need a confession. But they wanted one. Now that the ex-girlfriend had identified the ransom letter, the very note mailed from Atlanta, supposedly written by Annie herself, the Bureau had what it needed: a thread pulled straight from Wynn's hands. Still, Special Agent McLannan and his team knew that direct words, Wynn's words, could tie the knot around his neck. So they asked the woman for one more favor. She agreed. They wired her for sound. The plan was delicate. Meet Wynn. Reignite the old chemistry. Then nudge the conversation toward the past, toward that envelope, that letter, that moment. The meeting took place in the soft hush of a Florida cafe. The microphone hummed beneath her collar. FBI surveillance teams were tucked in cars nearby, listening through static in prayer. She asked him about the letter, why he'd made her send it, what it had meant. Wynn didn't raise his voice. He didn't show surprise. He simply leaned in and whispered what would seal his fate. Don't talk about that. Just forget it happened. Those words, so simple on paper, were heavier than cement. The Bureau now had him, not just in theory, not just in motive, but in voice. The next move was swift. On the morning of March 11, 1989, Alfred Wynn was taken into custody. The charges read like a script from a twisted legal thriller: conspiracy to commit kidnapping, attempted extortion, and perjury. But one thing was still missing: Annie Laurie Herron. Wynn sat stone-faced during questioning. No emotion. No confessions. His silence was surgical, the kind honed from years of courtroom defense and personal denial. So the FBI turned their attention to the objects he left behind. His office, cold and orderly, became a crime scene of possibility. Among the stacks of paper and dusty binders, they found a Royal brand typewriter, the same model used for the ransom note. A perfect match? Not quite. The forensic team went to work, aligning the letter forms, studying the typeface indentations. Conclusion: this wasn't the machine that typed the ransom note. It was too clean. Too convenient. The agents knew it immediately. Wynn had planted the typewriter. He wanted them to find it. A decoy. A trick. But now they had a pattern. Wynn wasn't just hiding his crime. He was curating the evidence. Then came another breadcrumb. A business card. Tucked into a file. Almost overlooked. It belonged to a truck rental company. A quick visit to the owner revealed what they suspected: Wynn had rented vans on multiple occasions. Each trip logged roughly 800 kilometers, the exact distance of a round trip between St. Petersburg and Jackson, Mississippi. Now the frame was building. Wynn had motive. Opportunity. Paranoia. And the means to move a body across state lines without a trace. But motive isn't a verdict. And so, the FBI zeroed in on the weakest link: Wynn's assistant. The young man who had once lied to protect him, claiming Wynne had been at a bar on the night of the abduction, now faced perjury charges of his own. Under pressure, he cracked. He admitted the alibi was fiction. Wynne had disappeared that night, without explanation. That confession gave prosecutors the final tool they needed. The indictment wasn't just holding. It was closing. On January 29, 1990, the case of United States v. Alfred Wynne opened in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. The trial played out like a courtroom drama scribbled in smoke and regret. The defense claimed coincidence. The prosecution built a mosaic of deliberate evil. The planted typewriter. The letters sent by a proxy. The rental vans. The recorded denial. The forged plea. The 12 men. The silence. And at the heart of it all, the woman no one could find. The jury deliberated. Then delivered its answer. Guilty. Alfred Wynne was sentenced to 19 years and 7 months in federal prison, the maximum allowed under the law. He was sent to Coleman Federal Correctional Complex in Florida. No parole. No escape. No peace. But for the Herron family, justice was a bitter draught. Because even as the courtroom doors closed behind Wynne, Annie Laurie Herron was still missing. Alfred Wynne was now behind bars. But the question that had haunted every agent, every witness, every sleepless night remained untouched. Where was Annie Laurie Herron? The FBI knew they had won the legal war. But without a body, without the final page in this grim chapter, the case hung in limbo, a solved equation missing its last digit. So the Bureau kept pushing. They returned to Wynne's law office, combing it again, not with hope, but with obsession. Somewhere, they believed, the truth had been hidden in plain sight. And there, amid the dust and discarded ambitions, they found a card no one had noticed before. It was simple. A local truck rental company. The agents moved fast. The owner recognized Wynne instantly. Yes, he said. He came in more than once. Always asked for the same type of van. Took it out for long runs, over 800 kilometers at a time. It wasn't a confession. But it was a roadmap. Wynne had moved something or someone across state lines. Quietly. Methodically. And always alone. But again, the trail cooled just before the fire. They never found the van he used. Never discovered a shovel. Never uncovered the sealed basement mentioned in the forged letter. It was like chasing smoke in the dark. They had perjury. They had conspiracy. But they didn't have closure. And Wynne? He said nothing. January faded into spring. The Bureau waited, hoping time would break Wynne's pride. But the man who had once whispered revenge to a psychic now sat in a federal cell with the silence of a tomb. Robert Herron, the titan who had moved mountains to bring his wife home, passed away on November 28, 1990. A heart attack ended his search. He died never knowing if Annie had been alive when he mailed those checks. Never knowing what final horror she may have endured. 2 years after her disappearance, a judge signed the declaration. Annie Laurie Herron, legally deceased. But for her family, it meant little. A document can't bury the unknown. It can't answer a scream no one heard. In May 1991, the estate was settled. Money passed. Properties shifted. But grief hung where no paperwork could reach. The FBI closed the file, not with satisfaction, but with sorrow. The case remains, to this day, one of the Bureau's most unsettling stories. No confession. No grave. No goodbye. Just a name, etched in loss. Annie Laurie Herron, the billionaire's wife who vanished without a trace. Some mysteries are solved in courtrooms. Others never leave the shadows.